An elderly woman received the heartbreaking news of her son's death and rushed to the hospital in a panic. But when the casket was opened, everyone was left in shock, completely frozen in disbelief. Marcella had never considered love to be her destiny. Her life, defined by solitude and an endless routine of work, had left her cynical about romance. That was until Simon came into her world, as sudden and refreshing as a summer breeze. His confident demeanor and warm smile felt like sunlight breaking through her shadowed existence. Simon wasn't like the men she had encountered in her modest social circles. He had a way of making her feel seen, cherished even, as if the weight of her loneliness could finally be lifted. Under the flickering lights of a town fair, he had taken her hand, his eyes locking with hers. "You're everything I've ever dreamed of," he said with such sincerity that Marcella allowed herself to believe him. For the first time, she entertained the idea of a future filled with joy. Simon promised her a life of adventure, a home, children, and freedom from the monotony of the small town she had grown to resent. For months they lived in a bubble of happiness, exploring hidden lakes and sharing quiet meals at quaint restaurants. Marcella let her walls crumble, giving herself to a love she had never thought possible. But love, as Marcella soon learned, could be as fleeting as the seasons. The day she told Simon about the baby, her world shifted. She had rehearsed the moment countless times, imagining his joy and their shared plans for the future. Instead, his reaction was colder than she had feared. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice devoid of the warmth she had come to rely on. Marcella nodded, her heart pounding with a mix of hope and dread. Simon sighed, placing his coffee cup on the table with deliberate care. "This wasn't part of the plan," he said, his tone sharp, almost rehearsed. "I'm not ready to be a father." Marcella stared at him, searching his face for any sign of the man she had trusted with her dreams. "You promised me," she began, her voice trembling. "I didn't promise this," he interrupted, pulling a crumpled bill from his pocket and laying it on the table. "Do what you need to do, Marcella." And with that, he was gone, leaving her alone with the weight of his betrayal. The days that followed were a blur of whispered gossip and judgmental glances. The small town, once her predictable sanctuary, became a place of scorn. Neighbors murmured behind her back, their disapproval cutting deeper than she cared to admit. Yet Marcella refused to let their words define her. She carried on, holding tightly to the fragile hope that her child would be worth every sacrifice. One night, while working a grueling late shift at a convenience store, Marcella met Rosalba. The woman, dignified yet approachable, entered the store seeking a quick coffee but left behind something far more valuable: kindness. Rosalba noticed Marcella's weary frame and the growing curve of her belly. "Are you all right, dear?" she asked, her voice tinged with genuine concern. Marcella, unaccustomed to such warmth, forced a smile. "Just tired as usual," she replied. Rosalba's gaze lingered for a moment before she spoke again. "You shouldn't be doing this alone. Let me help." As it turned out, Rosalba ran a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting young mothers. She offered Marcella a better-paying job and access to resources that felt like a lifeline. More importantly, Rosalba gave her hope. "This child will be the best thing to ever happen to you," Rosalba said one afternoon as they sorted through paperwork. "What Simon did to you doesn't define who you are. You define your future." Those words planted a seed of strength within Marcella. With Rosalba's help, she began to piece her life back together, one step at a time. She saved money, planned for her child's arrival, and slowly rebuilt her sense of self-worth. Each day brought new challenges, but Marcella faced them with a determination that grew alongside her swelling belly. The morning Antonio was born, the world seemed both chaotic and serene. The bright lights of the clinic, the hurried footsteps of nurses, and the sharp pangs of labor all blurred together in Marcela's memory. But the moment she heard her son's first cry, everything else faded away. A nurse placed the tiny, wriggling bundle in her arms, and Marcela's heart overflowed with a love she hadn't known was possible. "Antonio," she whispered, her fingers brushing against his soft cheek. "My sweet Antonio, I promise I will always protect you, no matter what." Tears streamed down her face as she kissed his forehead, sealing her vow. In that instant, Marcela knew every hardship, every betrayal had led her to this moment. Antonio wasn't just her son. He was her purpose, her second chance at a life worth living. And she would face the future with the fierce love of a mother who had everything to fight for. The years that followed were full of hardship and difficulty. Working during the day at the store and caring for Antonio at night had become Marcela's routine. Some nights, her hands trembled with exhaustion as she washed dishes or tidied up the small room they shared. Yet, a single laugh from Antonio made all her efforts worthwhile. "Love, do you want to hear another story?" she would ask every night while tucking him in. Antonio, with his wide, curious eyes, always nodded eagerly. Marcela created tales of brave heroes, magical creatures, and impossible adventures, weaving in lessons about love, family, and perseverance. As Antonio grew, Marcela noticed how he absorbed every word, every gesture. By the time he turned 6, it was clear he had a sharp mind. He was curious, quick to learn, and always found clever ways to solve problems. But what made Marcela proudest wasn't his academic success. It was his kindness. "Antonio, why did you give your lunch to that boy at school?" she asked one evening as they shared dinner at their small wooden table. "Mom," Antonio said, shrugging. "He was hungry. You always say we should help others, right?" Marcela smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "Yes, my love. We should always help whenever we can." The years went by and Antonio never ceased to amaze her. He wasn't just the top student in his class, he was also a standout athlete. His soccer skills became the talk of the town, and Marcela became his biggest fan, attending every game no matter how tired she was. She always wore a blue scarf, the color of Antonio's team, and cheered so loudly that she often lost her voice. "That's my son!" she'd shout from the stands every time Antonio scored a goal. Antonio, flashing a wide smile, would always send her a small wave, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. While Antonio thrived, Marcela continued to face challenges. Expenses kept piling up, and her job at the store wasn't always enough. Many nights she lay awake, worrying about how she would afford school supplies or Antonio's soccer uniform. But she never let her son see her struggle. "We're fine, my love," she'd say with a smile, even when her heart was heavy with worry. The day Antonio received a letter from a prestigious university, Marcela couldn't hold back her tears. "Mom, I got a full scholarship," Antonio said, his hands trembling as he held the envelope. "I can study engineering, just like I always dreamed." Marcela hugged him tightly, a mix of pride and sadness washing over her. She had worked so hard to give him this opportunity, but the thought of him leaving for another state filled her with an aching loneliness. "I'm so proud of you," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "This is a wonderful opportunity, Antonio. I want you to take it and chase your dreams." "But Mom, will you be okay by yourself?" Antonio asked, his voice filled with concern. "I'll always be okay as long as you're happy," Marcela replied, gently cupping his face. "Just promise me You won't forget to call your mother every now and then." Antonio laughed and promised, but Marcella knew it wouldn't be that simple. Over the next few weeks, she helped him pack, offering advice on how to take care of himself. When the day of his departure arrived, she accompanied him to the bus station. Antonio tried to stay strong, but in the end he couldn't help but hug her tightly, letting a few tears fall. "Mum, everything I am is because of you," he said before boarding the bus. Marcella, smiling through her own tears, waved as she watched her son disappear into the horizon. Antonio's first semester at the university was a whirlwind of emotions and challenges. He was far from his mother, his home, and the warmth of the small town where he had grown up. However, the excitement of learning new things and stepping into a bigger world filled Antonio with energy. From his very first day of classes, Antonio excelled in his computer science major. His professors quickly noticed his natural ability to solve complex problems, his quick grasp of new concepts, and his creativity in tackling projects. Meanwhile, Marcella eagerly awaited each phone call from her son. Though his voice grew more mature and confident with every conversation, she could detect the exhaustion in his tone. "Mum, they gave us such a tough project today," Antonio would say, pausing as Marcella filled the silence with words of encouragement. "But I'll get it done, don't worry." Marcella listened intently, celebrating his achievements and calming his fears, even as the loneliness in her heart grew with each passing week without him. "I'm so proud of you, my love," she would always remind him, hoping those words would stay with him during difficult times. Over time, Antonio not only became one of the top students in his class, but also a natural leader among his peers. He led teams in student competitions and won awards that earned him recognition in university newsletters. But what truly delighted Marcella were the small personal details he shared with her. The taste of tacos from a street vendor near campus, the constant hum of trucks in the city, and the laughter he shared with new friends. It was his way of staying connected to her despite the distance. When graduation day finally came, Antonio walked across the stage with honors, proudly holding his diploma. From the front row, Marcella couldn't hold back her tears. "This is just the beginning, Mum," he told her after the ceremony, embracing her tightly. Not long after, Antonio secured a position at a prestigious software company in the city. Though the pace of work was intense, he thrived in the competitive environment, applying everything he had learned and more. It was at this job that Antonio met Selena, a colleague with an unstoppable personality. From the moment she joined the team, Selena stood out. She was sharp, ambitious, and had a natural charisma that drew people in. For Antonio, still adjusting to his new professional life, Selena became both a mentor and, eventually, something more. Their initial conversations about work evolved into long talks about dreams and aspirations. Selena spoke passionately about her plans to start her own business, and Antonio, inspired by her drive, began envisioning how they could collaborate. To Marcella, Selena was initially just another name mentioned during her son's phone calls. But as her name came up more frequently, Marcella began to take notice. Antonio and Selena's relationship blossomed quickly. Selena not only shared Antonio's ambition, but also had a way of pushing him beyond his limits. It was Selena's idea to start their own company. Though Antonio hesitated at first, his trust in her ultimately convinced him. Together, they developed an innovative product that caught the attention of investors almost immediately. During the rare visits Antonio made to the village, Marcella noticed a change in him. While he was still loving and attentive, he seemed more distracted, consumed by his work. "Mum, the company is doing amazing," he told her during one visit. "Selena has such a talent for big ideas. I never imagined we could grow so fast." Marcella smiled, but something felt off. There was something in the way Antonio spoke about Selena that unsettled her. It wasn't jealousy or mistrust, just a mother's intuition she couldn't shake. One day, Antonio arrived home unexpectedly with an announcement that would change everything. "Mum, I need to talk to you about something important," he began, sitting in the small living room where he had spent his childhood. Marcella watched him closely, sensing that this was a pivotal moment. "I want to ask Selena to marry me. I think she's the person I want to spend my life with." For a moment, Marcella said nothing. She looked at her son, now a grown man, but with the same expression he had as a boy when he asked for permission to play outside. But this time, she couldn't simply say yes. "Antonio, I want you to be happy," she began cautiously. "But are you sure you really know Selena? Sometimes people show a different side of themselves when things change." The tension in the room was almost suffocating. Antonio abruptly stood, crossing his arms as though he needed a physical barrier against his mother's words. "You always do this, Mom," he finally said, his voice heavy with frustration and pain. "You always assume the worst about people, without even giving them a chance." Marcella met his gaze calmly, though her heart was racing. "That's not true, Antonio," she replied. "I trust you, but I have every right to be concerned. You're my son. And Selena, there's just something about her that doesn't sit right with me." "You don't even know her," Antonio shot back, raising his voice, something he rarely did. "Selena isn't just my partner. She's my teammate, my support. She's helped me build everything we have. Why can't you just be happy for me?" Marcella wanted to respond, to explain her unease, but she stopped when she saw the determined look in his eyes. For the first time, Antonio seemed completely unreachable, intent on shutting her out. "Fine," she murmured, dropping her gaze. "I just want you to be happy. I just don't want you to get hurt." Antonio shook his head, his frustration evident. "I won't, Mom, because I trust her more than anyone." Without another word, he gathered his things and left the house without saying goodbye. The echo of the closing door lingered, a sound that seemed to mark a shift in their relationship, dividing it into a before and after. The following days were a blur of heartache for Marcella. Antonio's absence, both physical and emotional, weighed heavier than she had imagined. She had faced countless hardships in her life, but nothing had prepared her for the void left by the distance between her and her son. At night, she found herself replaying their argument over and over, questioning if she had been too harsh or if she should have kept her thoughts to herself. "Maybe I'm just being an overprotective mother," she whispered to herself one evening as she washed dishes, her eyes drifting toward the dark sky outside her kitchen window. Yet, no matter how much she rationalized, a persistent feeling gnawed at her. Something wasn't right. Her intuition, that inner voice that had guided her through so many uncertain times, refused to be silenced. When Antonio and Selena's wedding took place, it was a small, private affair attended only by close friends and colleagues. Selena had insisted that Marcella not be invited, arguing that it would avoid unnecessary tension. Though Antonio hesitated at first, he ultimately agreed, convinced it was the best decision. Marcella didn't learn about the marriage from Antonio, but rather from an accidental message from an old acquaintance in town. "Congratulations on your son's wedding," the message read, accompanied by a photo of Antonio and Selena smiling beneath an arch of white flowers. Marcella felt something inside her break. She had hoped, deep down, that Antonio would come back to her before making such a life-altering decision, that he would try to reconcile. Instead, she spent that night staring at the photo, searching Antonio's face for answers. "Are you truly happy, Antonio?" she whispered into the emptiness of her small living room. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to find solace in the thought that, at least, Antonio believed Selina would bring him happiness. The first year of marriage brought tremendous changes for Antonio and Selina. Their business flourished, attracting more clients and investments. But with success came stress. Antonio spent long hours working, while Selina increasingly took control of important decisions. At first, Antonio saw this as a way to share responsibilities. But soon, he realized Selina was becoming more dominant, questioning his ideas and dismissing his concerns. "Listen, Antonio," Selina said one night as they reviewed documents in their office. "We can't afford any mistakes now. This is bigger than both of us. If you can't handle it, maybe you should let me take the reins." Exhausted from months of non-stop work, Antonio had no fight left in him. He simply nodded, conceding once again, though, deep down, he felt as if he was losing not just control of their business, but of his own life. Selina, on the other hand, seemed unfazed, treating each problem as a minor obstacle she could easily overcome. For Antonio, however, the mounting pressure was like a growing shadow, enveloping him more each day. He thought about calling his mother for comfort, but his pride and the weight of their last argument kept him silent. One quiet morning in Marcella's small home, the dawn broke gently, promising another ordinary day. As she brewed her coffee, enjoying the stillness, her phone buzzed with a message. It was brief, direct, and carried a weight that Marcella didn't immediately comprehend. "I'm sorry for your loss. I didn't know Antonio had passed." For a moment, Marcella thought it had to be a mistake. "This can't be," she whispered, her hands trembling as she read the message over and over. The coffee cup she was holding slipped from her grasp, shattering on the floor, but she barely noticed. Desperately, she grabbed her phone and dialed Antonio's number. All she got was the cold, unfeeling tone of his voicemail. She called several people who might know something, and finally, an old friend of Antonio's answered, his voice heavy with grief. "Selina told us Antonio passed away in his sleep. It seemed sudden. No one expected it." Marcella felt the world beneath her crumble. Her son, her Antonio, was gone. A cloud of disbelief and pain enveloped her, but behind the tears and the initial shock, something else began to surface. A gnawing sense that something wasn't right. In the city, Selina moved with uncharacteristic speed. Within days, she had arranged the funeral, ensuring everything was carried out with the utmost discretion. Invitations were sent to a small group of close acquaintances. Marcella, Antonio's mother, was not among them. Marcella found out about this exclusion through another call. "Didn't you know the funeral is already planned? It's tomorrow," said an acquaintance. Rage and grief collided in Marcella's chest. "How dare Selina exclude me?" she thought, clenching her fists. Although the distance between her town and the city was considerable, Marcella resolved to let nothing stop her. Antonio was her son, and she had every right to say goodbye. The journey was long and exhausting. Marcella spent hours on the bus, staring blankly at the passing scenery, her mind consumed by memories of Antonio, from his childhood to his final years. How could everything have ended so suddenly? When she arrived in the city, the cold and oppressive atmosphere seemed to echo her grief. She went straight to the funeral home, an elegant venue starkly contrasting Antonio's humble roots. From outside, she saw a small group of people entering silently. Selina was there, dressed in black, surrounded by some of her colleagues from work. Marcella entered, and the room went still, surprised faces turning toward her. Selina's expression hardened as she noticed her presence. "What are you doing here?" Selina asked, her voice low but filled with tension. "I came to say goodbye to my son," Marcella replied firmly. "No one, not even you, has the right to deny me that." Selina tried to stop her, but Marcella ignored her and moved toward the closed casket at the center of the room. Something about the atmosphere felt off. The perfectly arranged flowers, the soft background music, it all seemed staged, more like a carefully designed event than a genuine tribute to Antonio's life. Marcella stood before the casket, her heart pounding. Something deep inside her screamed that not everything was as it seemed. She turned to Selina, who remained stiff in the corner, her eyes flashing silent warnings. But Marcella was resolute. "I want to see my son one last time," she declared, her voice steady and unyielding. "It's not necessary, Marcella," Selina replied, her tone cold but controlled. "He's at peace now. There's no reason to disturb him." Marcella felt a surge of anger and pain. "He's my son," she said, taking a step closer to the casket. "I have the right to say goodbye, to see him one last time. You can't take that from me." Selina, her usual composure slipping, quickly moved to block her path. "I'm telling you it's not a good idea," she said, her voice rising. "Let him rest." The tension in the room thickened. The few attendees looked on uncomfortably, whispering among themselves but not daring to intervene. Marcella's fists clenched at her sides, her determination unwavering. "Step aside, Selina," she said, her voice filled with quiet fury. "I will see my son, whether you like it or not." With a determination that surprised everyone in the room, Marcella pushed Selina aside and lunged toward the coffin. Hands tried to restrain her, but desperation gave her strength. In one swift motion, she lifted the coffin lid. A collective gasp filled the room. For a moment, silence prevailed, broken only by Marcella's shallow, frantic breaths. Inside the coffin lay Antonio, his face pale and body still. But Marcella's sharp eyes caught something others missed, a faint rise and fall of his chest, so slight it was almost imperceptible. "He's alive!" Marcella's voice shattered the silence. She turned to the crowd, her face a mixture of disbelief and urgency. "My son is alive. Help me!" For an instant, no one moved, as if her words were too shocking to process. Selina stood frozen, her face drained of color. Finally, one of Antonio's friends fumbled for his phone and dialed for an ambulance. While they waited, Marcella stayed by Antonio's side, her trembling hands brushing against his cold face. "Hold on, my love," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Mama is here. Everything will be okay." The once solemn room dissolved into chaos. Some tried to comfort Marcella, while others turned on Selina, bombarding her with questions. But Selina remained silent, her gaze fixed on Antonio, as if trying to regain control over what had slipped beyond her grasp. When the paramedics arrived, their swift assessment confirmed what Marcella already knew. Antonio was alive, though barely. They carefully removed him from the coffin and rushed him to the hospital. Marcella climbed into the ambulance beside him, clutching his hand as if her grip alone could tether him to life. At the hospital, doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize Antonio. Marcella waited outside the emergency room, her mind racing with questions. How had her son ended up in such a state? Why had Selina tried to bury him alive? The questions gnawed at her, but one thing was certain: this wasn't an accident. Before long, a police officer, a close friend of Antonio, arrived at the hospital. He had been at the funeral and, upon hearing what had happened, took immediate action. "This isn't normal," he told Marcella gravely. "I'm going to question Selina." The hospital's waiting room was oppressively quiet, save for the faint murmurs of voices in the corridors. Marcella sat in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs, her hands clasped tightly, her face etched with exhaustion. Though the doctors had assured her that Antonio was out of immediate danger, her heart remained restless. The betrayal her son had endured filled her with a storm of anger and sorrow. Meanwhile, in a separate room, the police officer faced Selina. His demeanor was firm, his gaze unwavering as he awaited her explanation. Selina, who had maintained an impenetrable exterior until now, began to unravel. Her hands trembled, and her eyes avoided his. "Selina," the officer began, his tone calm yet relentless. "We know Antonio wasn't dead. I need you to explain what really happened and why you tried to bury him alive." Selina glanced up briefly, her face pale and lips pressed tightly together. For a long moment she seemed torn between silence and confession. Finally, with a heavy sigh, she spoke. "Everything was going so well," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "The company was thriving, and Antonio trusted me more than anyone. But then he started asking questions. He wanted to review the financial records, make changes. I couldn't let that happen." The officer frowned. "And what did you do?" Selina swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she continued. "I gave him a sedative, something strong, but not enough to kill him. I just needed him to appear dead for a few hours, long enough for me to take control of everything without interference." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of her betrayal. The officer's expression hardened as he took in the gravity of what she had done. Selina, once so composed, now sat trembling, her carefully constructed facade crumbling under the weight of the truth. Marcella, sitting just beyond the interrogation room, could feel the enormity of what had transpired. The words fell like a sharp blow in the air. The officer, visibly skeptical, spoke in a cold tone. "And what was your plan after burying him alive? Did you really think no one would find out?" Selina didn't respond right away. Her eyes flickered with a mix of regret and frustration, as if she regretted more that her plan had failed than the act itself. "I didn't think Marcella would go that far," she murmured. "I always underestimated her." As Selina was escorted into police custody, Marcella was informed of what had transpired. A part of her felt a deep sense of relief, knowing the truth was finally surfacing, but the weight of everything that had happened remained overwhelming. Her son had been betrayed in the cruelest way imaginable, and while he was safe now, the emotional scars this ordeal would leave were undeniable. Shortly after, a doctor emerged from the intensive care unit and approached Marcella. "Your son is awake," he said with a reassuring smile. "He's weak, but stable. You can go see him now." Marcella felt a wave of relief wash over her. She quickly stood and followed the doctor down the hallway to Antonio's room. There he was, lying pale on the bed, tubes connected to his arm. But his eyes were open, gazing at her with a mix of confusion and gratitude. "Mom," Antonio whispered, his voice barely audible. "What happened? Why am I here?" Marcella approached and gently took his hand, her eyes welling with tears. "I found you, my love. Selina. She tried to hurt you, but you're safe now. You don't have to worry anymore." Antonio closed his eyes for a moment, as if her words were too much to process. When he opened them again, pain crossed his face. She tried to kill me?" Marcella squeezed his hand gently, her heart breaking as she saw the anguish in her son's expression. "I don't know how anyone could do something like that," she said, her voice trembling. "But what matters now is that you're alive. You're here with me." In the days that followed, Antonio began to regain his strength, but the emotional weight of what had happened lingered. Visits from the police officer to take his statement only underscored the severity of the situation. Antonio listened in disbelief as the details of Selina's confession were explained. Each revelation felt like a fresh wound, but also a wake-up call. "Mom," he said one afternoon as Marcella sat beside him, "you always told me to trust my instincts, to listen to the people who truly care about me. And I didn't. Selina blinded me. And now I understand what you were trying to warn me about." Marcella shook her head softly. "None of that matters now, Antonio. The only thing that matters is that you're here. You're alive. That's all I need." Antonio nodded, but the guilt in his eyes was unmistakable. "I promise I'll never ignore your words again, Mom," he said with firm resolve. "I'll never let anyone come between us." The day of Selina's trial arrived, carrying an air of inevitability. Marcella and Antonio sat together in the courtroom, surrounded by a mix of curious journalists and familiar faces from Antonio's workplace. The room was solemn, each word spoken weighted by the lives that had been irreversibly changed. Selina, dressed in a simple suit with an emotionless face, was escorted to the defendant's stand. Gone was the charismatic and dominant woman Antonio once knew. Now she faced the consequences of her actions with a resignation that seemed almost unnatural. The prosecutor laid out the evidence with precision: Selina's confession, medical reports confirming Antonio's poisoning, and manipulated financial documents. Each word struck like a hammer, building an airtight case that left little room for doubt. When the time came for her to speak, Selina offered no excuses. She simply lowered her head, accepting her fate. The sentence was harsh: years in prison for attempted murder and fraud, along with the loss of all rights to the company. Marcella felt a mix of relief and sadness as the judge's words echoed through the courtroom. Justice had been served, but the damage Selina had caused could never be undone. After the trial, Antonio looked at his mother, his eyes filled with gratitude. "This wouldn't have been possible without you, Mum," he said, as they walked out of the courthouse. Marcella gave him a faint smile. Though her heart felt heavy, she knew the real battle was just beginning. In the months that followed, Antonio embarked on the arduous task of rebuilding the company he had created. The initial days were chaotic, endless meetings, tough decisions, and a team still reeling from Selina's leadership. But with Marcella's steady guidance, Antonio began not only to restructure the company, but also to restore the trust of the people who depended on him. "Remember, son," Marcella said one afternoon as they worked through documents in her modest apartment, "leadership isn't just about making the right decisions. It's about proving you're someone people can trust. They'll follow someone they believe in, not someone who just gives orders." Antonio nodded, taking her words to heart. Over time, his efforts bore fruit. The company regained its stability, and employees began to see Antonio not just as a boss, but as a leader who had overcome immense challenges to protect what they had built together. Despite his demanding workload, Antonio never neglected Marcella. The long conversations they once avoided became cherished moments in his day. Even on his busiest days, he found time to visit her. "I don't want us to grow apart again, Mom," he would say. "Nothing is more important than our relationship." While Marcella was proud of her son's growth, both as a person and a leader, her protective instincts remained. She had witnessed the hardships he endured and feared the world might hurt him again. But she chose to trust him, knowing he had changed. Life eventually settled into a peaceful rhythm for Marcella and Antonio. After months of uncertainty, pain, and hard lessons, they found a balance that allowed them to look toward the future with hope. Antonio, fully recovered, returned to his work with a renewed perspective. The company, once a symbol of his ambition, now stood for something deeper, an opportunity to build something truly meaningful, guided by the values his mother had instilled in him. "I get it now, Mom," Antonio said one day as they reviewed paperwork at her kitchen table. "Work is important, but I'll never let it define my life again. I've learned to value what really matters." Marcella smiled, her heart swelling with pride. Antonio wasn't just growing as a businessman, he was maturing as a person. "I always knew ambition alone wasn't enough," she replied. Antonio sat at his desk, the faint hum of the city outside reminding him of how far he had come. Leaving behind the corporate world wasn't an easy decision, but he felt it was the right one. His new path was clear, to create something that mattered. The non-profit he envisioned was more than just an organization. It was a way to give others the opportunities he wished he'd had. It would help young people discover their potential, offering mentorship and guidance to those navigating the same uncertainties he once faced. Marcella, watching his progress, couldn't have been prouder. Antonio had not only survived his past, but transformed it into something powerful. For Marcella, life also began to shift. After years of pouring everything into her son, she realized it was time to rediscover herself. One afternoon, encouraged by Antonio, she enrolled in an art class at the community center. It was a passion she had abandoned long ago, but picking up a brush again felt like returning to an old friend. The colors and textures awakened a part of her that had been dormant for years. As she painted, Marcella found a quiet joy in expressing herself, and Antonio's unwavering support became her anchor. Their relationship deepened in ways neither had anticipated. Simple moments turned into treasured memories, cooking meals together, strolling through the park, or sharing quiet evenings discussing their dreams. Antonio often reflected on how much he owed his mother, not just for her sacrifices, but for her strength. "You've always been my rock, Mom," he told her one evening over coffee. "Everything I've achieved is because of you." Marcella smiled, her heart swelling with pride. She saw in him the man she had always hoped he would become, kind, thoughtful, and resilient. Together they began crafting a life rooted in mutual respect and love. Antonio's nonprofit gained momentum quickly. After months of planning, he organized its launch event, inviting community leaders, friends, and supporters. Marcella was the guest of honor, a title she wore with quiet humility. As Antonio stood before the crowd, his voice steady but full of emotion, he spoke of their journey. "Success isn't measured by wealth or titles," he said, his gaze finding Marcella in the front row. "It's about the people who stand by you, who lift you up when you're at your lowest. My mother taught me that, and I'm here today because of her unwavering belief in me." The room erupted in applause, but Marcella's eyes brimmed with tears. In that moment, every hardship, every sleepless night, and every sacrifice felt worth it. Their days settled into a peaceful rhythm after the event. Antonio made it a point to include Marcella in his life, whether by inviting her to small dinners, taking her to non-profit gatherings, or simply enjoying quiet evenings at home. One sunny afternoon, as they walked under the sprawling trees of the local park, Marcella spoke softly. "You've grown so much, Antonio. I see it in everything you do. I couldn't be prouder of the man you've become." Antonio stopped, looking at her with deep gratitude. "It's because of you, Mom. You showed me what matters most." Their bond, forged through trials and triumphs, was now unshakable. The shadows of the past no longer loomed over them. Instead, they walked forward together, filled with hope and purpose. As they left the park that day, the sunlight seemed to wrap around them, a quiet reminder that their love and resilience would always guide them. For Marcella and Antonio, the future was no longer something to fear. It was an open canvas, ready for the colors of their shared dreams and the promise of a life well lived. And that's where this unbelievable story leaves us, frozen in shock, just like everyone at the hospital that day. What would you do if faced with such an unexpected twist? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping tales that make you think, feel, and question. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.